Let's discuss 3 lessons for you to crush $1, $2, no limit hold'em cash games. Currently, right now, today, 1-2 no limit hold'em cash games and smaller are booming, both online and live. I have a bunch of students playing live poker cash games who are crushing it and moving up, and I personally have been playing a lot of 1-2 no limit on coin poker recently, and right now, these games are very beatable. If you want to crush these games, you need to have a good, strong, fundamentally sound strategy, both pre-flop and post-flop, and then you need to make a point to adjust to take advantage of the mistakes your opponents are making. And in this video, I'm going to help you learn how to use good, strong pre-flop strategy to increase your aggression, which will let you win far more than your fair share of the pots, both pre-flop and post-flop. Also, how to value bet more effectively. And then finally, we're going to be discussing the 2 most profitable spots to bluff that you will encounter over and over and over again. So let's get to lesson number 1. You need to increase your aggression pre-flop. Many small stakes players are simply way too loose and passive. This is true both online and live, but it is definitely true live. In a lot of small stakes games, you'll find that it goes to an $8 raise and then 7 callers. Well, this is a very, very, very beatable game because most of those callers are going to show up with pretty garbage ranges. You need to figure out how to consistently increase your stack without having to make the nuts, though. What a lot of these players are doing is they're putting in a pre-flop call of a raise, and then they're just trying to flop the nuts. And if they're playing multi-way pots and they flop the nuts and someone's going to pay them off with top pair no kicker, well, it's not that bad of a strategy. But if you can make these players fold pre-flop with a lot of their hands just by re-raising, or if they'll call with all sorts of nonsense pre-flop, getting the incorrect odds, money is going to trickle your direction. The way you do this is by taking the initiative pre-flop by 3-betting, by re-raising. This is going to result in you stealing pots that don't belong to you, and assuming you play with good, strong, reasonable ranges, you are going to have the range advantage and the stronger range in general on pretty much every flop, which will allow you to continuation bet the flop and continue to pick up a lot of pots that don't belong to you. So let's take a look at a few good, strong, fundamentally sound ranges. Let's presume we're playing 100 big blinds deep. This is going to be a great chart to use when you're playing online, such as in the 1-2 games on coin poker. So let's say we are playing 100 big blinds deep. You're on the button versus a cutoff 3 big blind raise. This is going to be a very default spot that you're going to be in, so you want to make sure you are using this range against good, strong opponents, and you're hitting the right frequencies within reason. The hands in red are re-raising, the hands in green are calling, and the hands in blue are folding. Let's take a look at what is re-raising every time. Aces, kings, queens, and ace-king for value. And then some of the hands that are barely playable, such as ace-10 offsuit, king-8 suited, king-7 suited, ace-6 suited, ace-5 suited, ace-2 suited. These hands like to 3-bet as well as a bluff. And then we have some hands that are, on the cusp of either being your marginal hands or your very strong hands, such as pocket jacks, pocket 10s, ace queen, king queen, and then some stuff like jack 10 suited, 10-9 suited, 6-5 suited, etc. Also 3-betting. Take a look at what is calling, though. It's a lot of hands that really don't want to 3-bet and then have to fold to a 4-bet, like good, strong suited hands and small and medium pairs. These are hands that really, really, really like to call. But I do want you to focus on the 3-betting range being very polarized when you are in position with your best hands, plus some hands that are on the cusp of playability. Doing this is going to make you really difficult to play against because when you do re-raise, your opponents are not going to know if you have a really good hand that's just happy to put the money in or a bluff. What a lot of people do wrong is they re-raise with only their best hands, and then when they call, well, they have a non-best hand, and that makes them very, very easy to play against post-flop. Now, when you're out of position, you're going to want to 3-bet far more often. Here we have when you are in the small blind versus a button raise, so you're going to be out of position now. Notice now you're 3-betting the vast majority of hands you're going to play. The only hands that opt to call are some suited aces, a few suited hands like queen-9 suited, ace-x suited, and then some small and medium pairs. Almost everything else you want to play wants to 3-bet. Take a look at what is not playing. What a lot of people do wrong from the small blind is they call far too wide with hands like 9-7 suited, 6-4 suited, king-4 suited, jack-10 offsuit, ace-8 offsuit. These hands are simply not good enough to play when someone raises in front of you. And, given this is how you're supposed to play against the button, you have to be even tighter against the earlier positions. So if you're consistently calling raises from the small blind with jack-10 offsuit and ace-9 offsuit and 10-7 suited, you're going to be torching your money. So make sure you're 3-betting adequately before the flop. That's going to make you far more difficult to play against, both pre-flop and post-flop right off the bat. Lesson number 2 is to value bet thinly and often. If you never value own yourself, meaning that you bet with a hand that is good a lot of the time, but not all the time, well, that means you're not value betting thin enough. A lot of players in small stakes games want to be close to 100% sure that they have the best hand to bet on the river, but that is actually not a good strategy at all. The best players know how to get value out of their good but non-premium hands. Also, unless your opponent proves that they can check raise bluff you, when you do value bet somewhat thinly and then they raise you, simply fold. It's okay to bet the flop and the turn and maybe even the river with top pair decent kicker. And then when most weak, tight, straightforward players in small stakes games, which is often going to be the case, when they check raise you on the river, they're almost always going to have a very good hand. Do not make the mistake of automatically paying them off with a hand because you think, well, I've put in a lot of money, I got to see what they have. No, you don't. They have the nuts. Let's take a look at a few examples. Here we have Jack 10 suited. We raise it up to $6 out of our $200 stack, and the big blind calls. Flop comes Jack 5-2. They check. We're definitely going to continuation bet for a small to medium amount on this very uncoordinated board. We bet $4. The opponent calls. Turns a 7 of spades, giving us a backdoor flush draw. They check. This is a great spot to continue betting. We bet $13. I could be convinced even bigger is even a little bit better in this spot, because if they have any sort of draw, they're probably going to continue. If they made any sort of pair, they're probably going to continue. So maybe even 14 or 15 or 16 is a little bit better. That may not sound like that big of a deal, but if you can eke in a few more dollars and get called by the exact same range that you're ahead of, well, that's a good result. Whatever, 13 is fine and good. We get called. River's a 7. The opponent checks. Now, this is a spot where a lot of people think if I bet, what are they going to call me with? Well, any jack, but you're in only okay shape against those, or a 7, which you lose to. And that is true. All those hands are not going to fold. However, if they have a worse jack, or any pocket pair, or maybe a 5, or maybe a 2, or maybe even ace high, they may decide to call because they realize that you could easily have a hand like king queen, or king 10, or queen 10, or 9-8 suited that would bet the flop and bet the turn and get to the river with, well, 9 high or queen high and feel very inclined to bluff. This is a spot where we definitely want to go for value. And if we do value bet and get raised, it's fine to fold. Here the pot's $47, we go 25. Typically on the river, you're going to want to have 2 bet sizes. When you're in position, you're going to want to bet something like 50% pot or bigger. Usually I make my smallest bet size about 50% pot, and my bigger bet size, pot size, or maybe even bigger than the size of the pot. Like right here, if we had a 7, betting huge would be quite good because the jack's just never going to fold, right? Same thing if we had a very good jack, or like ace jack, or pocket queens. These are hands that can get called by a jack and, well, win, even for a large amount. But with Jack 10, it's a little bit more difficult for your opponent to have a jack because you have one in your hand. And if you do overbet, a lot of people will start to fold out hands like pocket 4s every time. So typically, you want to be betting very big with a strong polarized range of your absolute best hands and some junk. And then you want to use a smaller bet size with mostly medium strength made hands, plus a few super nuts and a few bluffs. We go 25, opponent calls, and we win. Fine and good and easy. Make sure you get that value bet in on the river. Next, we have pocket 10s on the button. We raise. Big blind calls. Flop comes 9-6-4. Opponent checks. Definitely bet. This is a good spot to bet on the medium to large side as the board's more coordinated, such as when it contains a flush draw or a straight draw, but no straight or flush yet. You typically want to bet using a slightly larger size. So we do go $10 in the spot. The hands that really love to bet a slightly larger size are usually your best made hands that are the most vulnerable. And that's going to be a hand like pocket 10s or ace 9 or king 9 in this scenario, because they're almost always good, but they're very vulnerable to being outdrawn by any overcard and any straight card. So we go $10, the opponent calls. Turns a queen. They check. This is a spot where a lot of players automatically think, well, the overcard came, I better shut down. But if you think about it, when they check call your flop bet, they're not going to have a whole lot of hands containing a queen, right? Queen jack's just going to fold immediately. Queen 10, you block it. They could have queen 9, but the 9 blocks that. They probably don't have a whole lot of ace queen. That's going to 3-bet preflop. King queen would probably fold unless it's king queen of spades or clubs or diamonds, which they can't have now. So there's just not a whole lot of queens the opponent can have. And this is a spot where if they do have a 9, they're probably going to continue calling. Same thing for even a 6 or a 4. And you certainly don't mind charging the draws. So this is a pretty good spot to continue betting for a medium amount. The pot's 33, we go 20. That seems fine and good to me. What you don't want to do here is bet huge. A lot of people think, okay, I probably have the best hand. I want to make sure I get a lot of protection, so I'm going to bet 50. And yeah, you'll get a lot of protection, but when you get called, you're going to be drawing to 2 outs, and that's not where you want to be. We bet 20, the opponent calls. River is a 2 of clubs, and the opponent checks again. This may also seem like a spot where you should not value bet because, well, what's going to call you? Well, what's going to call you is any 9 pretty much every time, as long as you don't bet too big, and also a 6, maybe even some weaker bluff catchers. Of course, if your opponent has a queen, they're going to call, right? But remember, they probably don't have a whole lot of queens to call your flop continuation bet to begin with. So this is a great spot to bet. You want to go medium again. This is a very clear medium strength hand. You may say, if you only bet medium with your medium strength hands, don't you become vulnerable to getting check raised? And you do, which is why you want to make sure that you include some super nut hands in your range, such as sets, like pocket 4s in this case. That would be an okay hand to bet small with, or a hand like pocket queens, right? Pocket queens is a hand that blocks some of your opponent's auto calls with a queen, maybe pocket 9, same story. So while you do want to have 2 bet sizes, you want to make sure you bet you bet small with some of your very, very strong hands. However, in small stakes games, remember, most people will play a little bit loosey-goosey on the flop and the turn, but by the time they get to the river, when you bet the flop and the turn and the river, and they check raise you, they have a really good hand. So if they have a really good hand, how does pocket 10s do? Well, horribly. And as long as your opponents are not check raise bluffing very, very frequently, this is a super duper easy value bet with the intention of folding if they shove. That's what happens this time. We bet 40, the opponent shoves it all in, and fold. Probably have queen 9, or 3 of a kind. Simply fold and move on with your life. That is okay. Lesson number 3 is to find the most profitable bluff spots. This secret has made me a ton of money in cash games over the years. And essentially what happens is that when players check, when they take the passive option, their range is usually far too weak because most small stakes players bet with their best hands or raise with their best hands. So when they don't bet or raise, that means they're usually pretty weak. And that's especially true when they let it go check on any betting round when they could have bet. So let's discuss 2 spots. The first is when you're out of position on the river and your opponent checks the turn after betting the flop. So they continuation bet the flop, you call, and then they check on the turn. Let's take a look at this scenario. Here we have 8, 6 of spades in the big blind. The hijack raises up. We have an easy call. Jack, 9, 5. Backdoor flush draw. We check. They bet small. With the backdoor flush draw and the gut shot, we have an easy continue. We could maybe raise if we felt like getting spicy, but calling's good too. Definitely don't fold. Turn is a 4. We check. If the opponent blasts it here, we'll just fold. But they don't. They let it go check. This is the spot I'm talking about where they bet the flop and then they let it go check on the turn. Most players in most small stakes games will bet the turn with any jack or better made hand. That means that when they let it go check, they have a 9 at best. And if the 9 is the best hand they can have, well, they have a whole lot of other weaker hands too, like ace high, king high, queen high, small pairs, right? This is a great spot to be prepared to bluff on the river. River's a 3, pot's $21, we go 14. Make sure you use a rather large bet size like you would if you had a jack or maybe even a 9, because you are trying to get your opponent off of a hand essentially worse than a 9, like pocket 8s or worse. Now, maybe pocket 8s and 7s and 6s and ace 5 call every time, but most weaker hands will fold, and the opponent will have a whole lot of weaker hands, like ace high, king high, or queen high, when they bet the flop and then check behind the turn. So this is a great spot to bet the river using a decently chunky size, and you're going to find you pick up the pot quite frequently in this scenario. Another time to bluff is when you're in position on the river and your opponent checks after no bets went in on the turn. When it goes check on the turn and you're in position, most players feel like they must value bet the river when they have a good hand because they are afraid you'll let it go check and they'll miss out on value. So that means when they check, they usually don't have a very strong hand. And that opens them up to being bluffed. Let's say we raise 10-9 suited from the hijack and the big blind calls. We flop a double gut shot, queen 8-6, 2 spades. We have no spades. We bet $8 on this flop that contains flush and straight draws, but no flush or straight. Notice we're using a slightly bigger size on this very dynamic board. Bigger even could be better, like 10 or 12. The opponent calls. Turns a 5 of diamonds. This is a good card for them because we don't really have a whole lot of 9-7 and 7-4 in our range, but they do. They check. We could bet the turn, but this time we let it go check. Fine. River's a 2 of diamonds, and they check again. This is a spot where most players would value bet with a queen and maybe even an 8. So if they're betting with some queens and eights on the river and all better made hands, what does that mean they likely have? Well, it means they likely have pocket sevens or worse. And if you bet on the river, pocket sevens or worse is going to feel somewhat inclined to fold, and that's going to be especially true if they're sitting here with an unpaired hand. Especially when a bunch of draws miss, this is a great spot to bluff the river. So the pot's 29, we go 18. I could be convinced that perhaps even a little bit bigger is better to really try to put pressure on a random 6 or perhaps a random 5, like 7-5 of spades, because these are hands we are really trying to get to fold. Now, if your opponent's just going to snap call in this spot with any ace high, probably not a good spot to bluff. But most people in most games are simply going to fold when you bet on the river, thinking that you have a clear value hand, like an 8 or pocket 9s, that's just trying to get money into the pot. So, essentially, notice in both these scenarios, when the turn checks in a spot where your opponent could have bet, or they checked you on the river in a spot where they could have bet, logically, these are great spots to bluff if you cannot win at the showdown. Yes, you're going to be bluffing far more often than the game theory optimal frequency recommends, but this is a strong exploit against most players because when they bet, they usually have a very good hand, and when they check, they usually don't. So, that is it for today. 3 lessons to crush online 1-2 no limit cash games. If you enjoyed today's video, click the like and subscribe button down below. Click the notification bell. To recap, you need to increase your aggression pre-flop. Stop just calling and trying to see the flop. Next, you need to value bet thinly and often. And finally, you need to find the most profitable bluff scenarios when your opponents are way more likely to fold. If you focus on these things, you will crush 1-2 no limit hold'em. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And I'll talk to you next time.